Sarah Hayes did not slow her horse when she crossed onto Bishop land. She rode like the devil himself was at her heels, and in a manner of speaking he was. The mare's hooves thundered against the dry red earth, kicking up a storm of dust that rose behind her like smoke from a burning house. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins somewhere between the ridge and the creek, and it whipped against her face with every stride. She did not care. She could not afford to care about anything except the message she carried and the seconds that were bleeding away with every breath she took. Owen Bishop was going to die tonight if she did not reach him first. That thought alone kept her in the saddle. It kept her from turning back when she had crossed the invisible line that separated Hayes land from Bishop land, a line drawn in old grudges and spilled blood and 2 decades of bitterness her father had cultivated like a crop. She had crossed it anyway. She was crossing it now. She saw the lights of the Bishop Ranch house through the gathering dusk, and she pushed the mare harder. The hands saw her coming before she reached the gate. She heard shouts, saw lanterns swinging, and then 3 men were stepping out into her path with their hands near their holsters. She pulled up hard, the mare skidding on her haunches, and Sarah stood in the stirrups with her chest heaving. "I need Owen Bishop," she said. "Now, it cannot wait." One of the men stepped forward, squinting up at her through the dust. "You are a Hayes," he said, and the way he said it made it sound like an accusation and a death sentence in one breath. "Yes," she said, "I am. And that should tell you exactly how serious this is, because I would not be on this land for any reason in this world except the one I am carrying right now. So go get Owen Bishop, or I swear to you, whatever happens tonight will be on your hands as much as on my father's." The mention of her father cracked something open in the man's expression. He glanced at his companions, then turned and jogged toward the house without another word. Sarah stayed on her horse. Her hands were trembling against the reins, and she pressed her knees tighter against the mare's sides to steady herself. She had rehearsed what she would say on the long ride over. She had rehearsed it, and then abandoned the rehearsal because no amount of careful words could soften what she was about to reveal. The truth was the truth, and it was ugly, and it was going to hurt him. It was going to hurt her too. Because delivering this warning meant the end of whatever fragile, impossible, secret thing had been growing between them for the past 3 months. After tonight, he would know that the Hayes name was soaked in treachery all the way to the bone, and he would look at her and see nothing but her father's daughter. The front door of the ranch house opened. Owen Bishop stepped onto the porch, and even from this distance, even in the failing light, Sarah felt the familiar pull of him like a hook set deep in her chest. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and he moved with a steady, unhurried quality that she had always privately thought was the most dangerous thing about him. Not the rifle he could handle with frightening accuracy, not the reputation he had built as the most unyielding man in Cobb County. The most dangerous thing about Owen Bishop was the way he made you feel like the ground was solid when he was standing on it. He came down the porch steps and walked toward her, and she watched his face change as he recognized her. Surprise first, then something complicated and guarded that she could not entirely read. "Sarah Hayes," he said, stopping a few feet from the mare's nose. "You want to tell me what brings you to my gate looking like you just outran a stampede?" She dismounted before he finished the sentence, landing in the dust and closing the distance between them in 4 steps. When she was close enough that she did not have to raise her voice, she stopped. "My father is sending men to burn your south pasture tonight," she said. "And that is the least of it. He made a deal with Caldwell Fletcher to flood your water rights claim with false documents at the county courthouse tomorrow morning. If the fire does not drive you off, the legal trap will. He has been planning this for 6 weeks, Owen. He wants your land, and he has built this from the ground up, and tonight is when it all starts moving." The silence that fell between them was complete. She could hear the wind moving through the pampas grass beyond the fence line. She could hear one of the hands breathing somewhere to her left. Owen looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set, and his eyes were doing that thing they did when he was processing something at high speed behind a calm face. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this?" It was the right question. It was the only question that mattered, and it was the one she had been dreading most. "Because it is wrong," she said. "Because I will not be a part of it, even by silence. Your father will know it was you." "Yes." Another silence. He looked at her mare, then back at her face. Something shifted in his expression, something that came through the guard and made him look, just for a moment, like a man who had been handed something he did not know what to do with. "Come inside," he said. She had first spoken to Owen Bishop 93 days ago, in the town of Mesquite Crossing, which sat at the dusty center of Cobb County, Texas, in the spring of 1882. It had been a Tuesday, because the feed merchant opened his warehouse on Tuesdays and Fridays, and Sarah had been in town to collect an order for the Hayes Ranch. She had been loading sacks of grain into the back of the supply wagon when the merchant, a nervous little man named Delbert Sproat, had dropped his ledger and sent pages scattering in every direction across the wooden boardwalk. She had been to help him gather them, and when she had straightened up, holding a fistful of invoice pages, she had found herself looking directly at Owen Bishop. He had been watching her from 3 feet away, not with any particular expression. Just watching, the way a man watches when something has caught his attention and he has not yet decided what to make of it. "You are Hector Hayes's daughter," he said. "I am," she said. "And you are Owen Bishop." He nodded once. She handed him back his half of the scattered pages because he had bent to help gather them too, and their fingers had touched briefly at the exchange. And Sarah had thought, in a way that surprised her considerably, that she was in significant trouble. She had known who Owen Bishop was her whole life. Everyone in Cobb County knew who he was. He had come west from Tennessee 12 years prior, at the age of 22, with 2 horses, a modest amount of capital, and an absolute refusal to be beaten by anything. He had built the Bishop Ranch into the most productive operation in the county through sheer, stubborn endurance and good judgment, and he had done it while feuding with her father for the better part of a decade over water rights, grazing boundaries, and the general principle that Hector Hayes could not stomach another man's success in his own backyard. Sarah had grown up hearing her father refer to Owen Bishop in terms that were not printable in polite company. She had grown up understanding that Bishop was the enemy, that his prosperity was an insult, that the boundary between their lands was a front line in a war that would eventually have a winner. She had not grown up expecting that Owen Bishop would be 34 years old and look at her like that, and she had definitely not expected to feel anything about it. But she did feel something about it, and the feeling did not go away after Tuesday. It grew. It grew through a series of coincidental meetings in town that she eventually stopped pretending were entirely coincidental. It grew through conversations that started as cautious, careful exchanges, and gradually became something richer and more honest and more dangerous. It grew through a shared concern about the violence her father and his allies were capable of, and through the discovery that Owen Bishop was a man who thought carefully about things, who could be moved by principle, who had built his life on the conviction that a man was only as good as what he refused to do when it cost him something. He was exactly the kind of man she had stopped believing she would ever find in Cobb County. He was also completely forbidden, and Sarah knew it. She had known it from the Tuesday in Mesquite Crossing, and she had kept the knowledge sharp in her mind as a warning. But warnings, she had discovered, were considerably more effective when the thing you were warning yourself against was not also the most honest conversation you had managed to have with another human being in 3 years of living in a house full of secrets. Because the Hayes house was full of secrets. Had been, for as long as Sarah could clearly remember. Her father, Hector Hayes, was a man who had made his fortune in the early years of the cattle boom and had never developed the moral sophistication to match his material success. He was not a man who trusted laws or relied on courts when he could simply apply pressure directly. He ran his ranch and his county relationships the way some men ran a shell game, always moving things around, always keeping the other party slightly off balance, always ensuring that the advantage was his before the other man had finished figuring out the rules. Sarah's mother had died when Sarah was 11, and in the years since, Sarah had grown up inside her father's world with increasingly clear eyes and increasingly little peace. She had managed the household accounts and seen where money went. She had overheard conversations that were not meant for her ears. She had watched her father smile at men in town and then come home and discuss ruining them at the dinner table. She had stayed because there was nowhere to go. She was 24 years old and unmarried, living under her father's roof in 1882, and the options available to a woman in that position in Cobb County, Texas, were not extensive. She had stayed and kept her head down and tried to build a life inside the walls she had been given, and she had managed, mostly, to maintain the private conviction that she was not her father, that his choices were his choices, that she had some separate moral identity that the Hayes name had not contaminated. Then she had met Owen Bishop, and her private conviction had been tested in ways she had not anticipated. Because falling in love with Owen Bishop, she had come to understand in those 93 days, was not simply a personal thing. It was a political act in miniature. Every time she chose to seek his company, every time she let herself care what he thought, every time she held a real conversation with him, instead of performing the careful, neutral daughter of a man who wished him harm, she was drawing a line between herself and everything her father stood for. She had not thought, until 6 weeks ago, that she would ever be required to make that line visible to anyone but herself. 6 weeks ago she had come home late from town on a Thursday afternoon, and she had heard voices in her father's study. She had not intended to listen. She had been passing in the hallway, and the name she heard had stopped her feet without consulting her brain. Owen Bishop's name, and then the word arson. She had stood in that hallway for 17 minutes, listening through the half-closed door to her father and Caldwell Fletcher, who was a lawyer of flexible ethics and considerable land holdings, constructing a plan to destroy the Bishop Ranch in 2 stages. First, a coordinated fire in the south pasture that would drive off the cattle and ruin the season's grazing. Second, a set of fraudulent water rights documents filed at the courthouse in Fletcher's name that would legally strangle Bishop's operation at the source, denying him access to the creek that ran the length of his range. She had learned from those 17 minutes that her father had been working toward this for years, that the feud was not, as she had half believed, a matter of 2 proud men unable to get along. It was a deliberate campaign, and it was reaching its conclusion. She had also learned that the timeline was moving. The fire was planned for a Saturday in late April, when the Bishop hands would be away at the spring cattle gathering in the western range. Fletcher's documents were ready. Everything was in place. She had gone upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, and she had understood, with a clarity that had no mercy in it, that she had arrived at the moment she had been postponing for 3 years. The moment where keeping her head down was no longer a neutral act. The moment where silence made her complicit. She had also understood that warning Owen Bishop would mean telling him the truth about what her father was, and by extension, asking him to reconsider everything he might have privately begun to think about her. She would be arriving at his door wearing the Hayes name like a brand, asking him to trust the daughter of the man trying to destroy him. She had sat with all of that for 6 weeks, trying to find another way. She had not found one, and now she was inside the Bishop Ranch house, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of water someone had brought her, and Owen was standing across the room with his back to her, looking out the window into the dark. He had sent 3 of his hands to the south pasture within 2 minutes of hearing her story. He had sent another rider to town to find out what they could about the courthouse filing. He had done all of this quickly and without visible emotion, which was characteristic of him, and now he was standing very still at the window. "Who else knows you are here?" he asked without turning around. "No one," she said. "Your father will figure it out." "I know that." He turned then. His face was difficult to read, but there was something working in it that she had not seen there before, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like it hurt. "Sarah," he said, "I need to understand something. What you just did, riding over here telling me this, you know what it costs you? Yes. Your father is going to know by morning, maybe sooner. Yes. You will not be able to go back there." She had thought about that on the ride over, the wind in her face and the mare's hooves eating up the distance between the two lives she had been trying to maintain simultaneously. She had thought about the room upstairs in the Hayes house where all her things were, her mother's mirror, her books, the small wooden box where she kept the letters she had written and never sent. She had thought about all of it and decided, somewhere around the creek crossing, that those things were not what made a life. They were just objects in a room. "I know that too," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and sat down in the chair across from her, and the directness of it, the lack of ceremony, was so typical of him that she felt something inside her chest settle slightly despite everything. "Tell me one more thing," he said, "and be straight with me. I always am with you." "I know," he said, and the way he said it was quiet and meant something. "The 3 months, the town meetings, the conversations, was any of that your father's idea? Were you watching me for him?" It was the question that would have broken her heart if she had not also been the one asking it of herself. She held his gaze because she owed him that. "No," she said, "none of it. I swear to you, Owen, I never brought your name home. I never told him we spoke. What happened between us in those months was mine. It was the only thing I had that was entirely mine, and I protected it, and I am sorry that you have to take my word for that because I understand why you would question it." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the sound of hoofbeats as his men rode out toward the south pasture, fading into the night. "I do not question it," he said finally. The simplicity of that nearly undid her completely. She had prepared herself for suspicion, for anger, for a careful and reasonable examination of every conversation they had ever had. She had not prepared herself for him to just believe her, as though the question was already answered and had been for some time. "You need to understand what tonight means," she said, because she could not sit with his trust without being completely honest about the consequences. "Even if your men stop the fire, my father still has the documents. Fletcher still files tomorrow. The water rights will be tangled up in court for months, maybe years, and that will cost you. I know. And after what I have done tonight, my father will not stay still. He will escalate. He is not a man who accepts a setback, he responds to it. You and I have both put ourselves in a position where he is going to come after us harder than he was going to come after you before." "I know that too," Owen said. "I am not trying to frighten you." "I am not frightened." She believed him. That was the extraordinary thing about Owen Bishop. He was not fearless in the way that foolish men were fearless, the way her father was fearless, which was really just an inability to properly imagine consequences. Owen was something different. He was a man who had looked at hard things clearly and chosen his ground anyway. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Tonight, right now, you cannot go home." "I know that. My hand's quarters are not the place for you. You can take my housekeeper's room. She is staying in town this week with her daughter. You can stay here tonight, and in the morning we figure out the next piece." She almost said that she could not possibly stay under his roof, because she could hear exactly what her father would make of it and what the town would make of it and what it meant for her in terms of an already complicated situation. She almost said all of that. Instead, she said, "Thank you." The night moved like it was made of held breath. She sat in the kitchen while Owen coordinated with his men, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch in a state of controlled emergency. Voices at the door, brief and efficient. The smell of horses and lantern oil. The far-off sound of the wind in the pasture grasses. Owen moved in and out of the kitchen, updating her when he could, and each time he came back she watched him with the particular quality of attention she had been quietly paying him for 3 months without permission. Around midnight, one of his hands came in to report that they had found evidence of where the fire was meant to start, but had arrived before the men hired to light it. There had been a confrontation in the dark pasture, nothing she wanted to picture in detail, and the hired men had retreated. The south pasture was safe. Owen came and told her this himself, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and the lines of a long day deepening around his eyes. "Your father's men ran," he said. "My father hired drifters for it," she said. "He would not use his regular hands on something like this. Too much risk of them talking." "That is useful to know," Owen said, "and consistent with Fletcher filing the paperwork himself rather than through a clerk." "He is careful about distance," she said. "He always has been. He does not like his hands to be directly visible in the things he does." Except that his own daughter saw through it. She met his eyes across the kitchen. His daughter had better motivation than most. They looked at each other in the lamplight, and something moved between them that was not new exactly but was more visible than it had ever been allowed to be. She looked away first, because if she did not, she was going to say something that neither of them had the bandwidth for tonight. "Get some rest," Owen said. "We are going to need to move early tomorrow." She slept in the housekeeper's room, which was small and warm and smelled like cedar and soap, and she lay on top of the quilt in her traveling clothes and stared at the ceiling and thought about the fact that she had just, in the space of one evening, burned down the only home she had ever had and ridden straight toward the only one she had ever wanted, and whether those two things could be reconciled into something survivable. She was not sure. But she was here, and the south pasture was intact, and Owen Bishop was alive, and those were the facts she had come to deliver. She let them be enough for the night. She woke before dawn to the sound of a rooster making demands outside the window and the smell of coffee from the kitchen. She smoothed her hair as best she could without her pins and found Owen already at the table, 2 cups poured, a plate of biscuits from what must have been left from the previous day's baking. "Ryder came in about an hour ago," he said when she sat down. "Courthouse situation. My man in town got to the county clerk last night and pulled enough strings to get a flag on any filings first thing this morning. Fletcher will be watched." Sarah wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Fletcher is clever. He will have someone else file on his behalf." "I know. That is why I am sending you to the courthouse." She looked up. "You witnessed the conversation between your father and Fletcher 6 weeks ago. You heard the specifics of the plan. If you give a sworn statement to the county clerk this morning, it creates a record that will complicate anything Fletcher tries to do. It does not solve the problem, but it raises the cost of the deception considerably." "My father will know immediately," she said. "He is going to know by breakfast anyway." "You might as well make it count." She thought about this. "If I give that statement, I am testifying against my own father, publicly. Yes, that has consequences beyond what happens to his plan. It affects his standing in the county, his business relationships." "Yes," Owen said again. "You understand that I am willing to do it. I want you to understand that I know what it means." He looked at her across the table with that steady, direct quality that she had catalogued in her private thoughts so many times over the past months. "I know you know what it means," he said. "I also know you have been living inside what your father does for long enough that you are ready to be done with it. I am not asking you to do anything except what you were already going to do. I am just asking you to do it in the most useful way possible." She drank her coffee. "All right," she said. "I will go to the courthouse. I will ride with you." "Owen, you do not have to." "I know I do not have to." He said it in the same simple, declarative way he said most things, as though the logic of it was self-evident and further discussion was unnecessary, and Sarah felt the corner of her mouth turn up slightly despite everything. "You are a very direct man," she said. "I have found it saves considerable time," he said. They rode into Mesquite Crossing as the sun crested the eastern hills and turned the dusk golden. Owen rode on his black gelding, Ranger and Sarah rode the mare, and there was enough space between them for decorum but not quite enough for indifference, and anyone watching them come down Main Street might have thought, if they were paying close attention, that these were 2 people riding in the same direction in more ways than one. The county clerk's office opened at 7, and they were the second people through the door. Sarah gave her statement to the clerk. A methodical man named Thomas Aldrich who wrote everything down with the careful hand of someone who understood that paper was the architecture of civilization. She told him what she had heard. She named the date, the participants, the specifics of the plan. She signed her name at the bottom of the statement with a hand that trembled only slightly. When they came out of the courthouse, Caldwell Fletcher was across the street. He saw them at the same moment they saw him, and the expression that crossed his face moved through surprise and calculation and arrival at something cold with remarkable speed. He was a heavy man in a well-cut suit, with a lawyer's face that had learned to reveal nothing that could be used against it. He looked at Owen, then at Sarah, and his eyes lingered on her in a way that made the back of her neck tighten. He tipped his hat once and walked away. "He knows," Owen said quietly beside her. "He knew the moment he saw us together," Sarah said. "He is going to tell my father before noon." "What does your father do when he is outmaneuvered?" She thought about that. "He does not accept it," she said. "He looks for another angle." They rode back toward the Bishop Ranch, taking the long route around the edge of town to avoid the concentration of people who might be watching, and Sarah spent the ride thinking about angles. About her father's mind, which she knew as well as she knew her own hands. About the particular way Hector Hayes processed a setback. "He will come to you directly," she said, when they were back in the open range. "Is not going to send drifters again, not after last night. He is going to come himself with his foreman and however many of his regular hands he trusts enough to bring." Owen looked straight ahead between Ranger's ears. "When? Today, probably. He does not let things sit." "Then we do not let things sit either." He turned in the saddle to look at her. "When he comes, I want you somewhere he cannot use you as a pressure point. I am not going to hide. I am not asking you to hide. I am asking you to be somewhere that gives you options if things go sideways." She understood what he was saying. She also understood, for the first time with complete clarity, that he was not thinking about his land or his water rights or his legal standing right now. He was thinking about her safety, and the knowledge of that landed somewhere in her chest with a weight that was not uncomfortable but was very present. "Where do you suggest?" she asked. "There is a woman in town, Clara Brentwood, the school teacher. She is a good woman and she keeps her own counsel. You could stay with her today. And you?" "I will be at my ranch where I belong when your father arrives." "Owen, if he comes with his foreman and 4 or 5 hands, and he is as angry as I expect him to be, that is not a conversation. That is a confrontation with firearms. I have handled confrontations before. Not this kind, not with this much at stake for him." She pulled the mare up slightly so they were riding closer together. "He will not shoot you. He is many things, but he is not stupid enough to commit murder in front of witnesses in 1882. But he will try to talk you into something or pressure you into something, and he will use me to do it if he can. He will threaten to press charges against me for giving that statement. He might be able to claim I disclosed private business dealings between family members." Owen was quiet for a moment. "Can he?" "I do not know. Fletcher will tell him whether it is legally viable, but even the threat of it might put me in a difficult position." "I'm not letting him use you against me," Owen said, and the steadiness of his voice when he said it was something she felt in her bones. "And I'm not letting him get his hands on you while he is this angry. So either you stay in town with Clara Brentwood, or you stay at my ranch where I can see you, and I will let you choose between those 2 options, but I will not give you a third one." She looked at him. "Your ranch," she said. He nodded, as though this were the obvious answer and he had been waiting for her to arrive at it. Hector Hayes came at 3 in the afternoon. Sarah heard the hoofbeats from the front porch, where she was sitting in the shade with a book she had borrowed from the housekeeper's shelf and had not read a single page of. She stood up and looked out at the road and counted. Her father, his foreman whose name was Rance Cutler and who was loyal in the specific way that men were loyal when they were paid enough, and 3 ranch hands who she recognized by their horses. Owen appeared beside her on the porch. He had known they were coming, because one of his hands had been watching the road, but he had not sent anyone to intercept them. He had made her stay on the porch with him, which she had agreed to because she was not a coward, and because she needed to see this through. Hector Hayes reined up in front of the porch and looked at his daughter with an expression that she had seen before, an expression that lived in the space between fury and something that was almost grief. If her father was capable of grief, that was not primarily about himself. He was a big man, barrel-chested, with a gray beard he kept trimmed precisely and hands that had once worked cattle and now managed people with the same unrelenting grip. He was 60 years old and looked 50 and had never, in Sarah's experience, looked away from anything he wanted. "Sarah," he said. "Father," she said, "you want to tell me what you think you are doing?" "I think I am standing on a porch," she said, which was not at all the tone she had planned but emerged from somewhere past her rehearsed calm. Her father's jaw tightened. He shifted his gaze to Owen, and the look he gave him was the accumulated weight of a decade's worth of resentment filtered through the specific injury of the current morning. "Bishop," he said. "Hayes," Owen said. His voice was exactly level. He had not moved or shifted his weight or put his hand anywhere near his holster, and the stillness of him was more effective, Sarah thought, than any aggressive posture would have been. "You have my daughter. Your daughter is a grown woman standing on my porch of her own choosing," Owen said. "I am not in the business of having people, Hayes. Neither, I would suggest, should you be. She is 24 years old and she lives under my roof, and she has made statements that could damage my business dealings, which she had no right to do." "She had every right to do," Owen said. "A person who witnesses a plan to commit arson and fraud has not only the right but the obligation to report it. That is a matter of legal interpretation. Then let the law interpret it. The statement is made and filed and witnessed, and there is nothing either of us can do to change that now. The question in front of us is what comes next." Hector Hayes was quiet for a moment. He looked at Sarah again, and she did not look away, because she had decided on the porch this morning that she was done with the particular kind of cowardice that looks like loyalty. She had been protecting her father's image in her own head for 20 years, and it had cost her more than she could properly calculate, and she was done with the accounting. "You have ruined yourself," her father said to her, and his voice had dropped to something quieter that was worse than the loud version. "Everything I built, everything I planned. You went across to this man and handed it to him like he deserved it." "He did deserve it," she said. "He deserved the truth. He was going to lose everything because you decided his success was an insult to yours, and that is not justice, father. That is not even good business. It is just cruelty because you can." Something moved across her father's face. She had never spoken to him that directly before, and she could see him processing it the way a machine processes something it was not built to handle. "Come home," he said. "No," the word was clean and final. She felt Owen shift slightly beside her, not toward her exactly, but in a way that she registered as presence, as backing. "Sarah." "No," she said again. "I am not going to come home. I am not going to pretend I did not hear what I heard 6 weeks ago. I am not going to watch you take everything away from someone because you can, and I am not going to keep my mouth closed about it. If that means I have no place in your house, then I accept that, but I will not change it." The silence that followed was the longest of Sarah Hayes's life. Her father sat on his horse in the afternoon sun and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and in the space between them was 24 years of love that had been tangled up with something ugly for so long that she could not separate the strands anymore. She loved him the way you love a place that has hurt you, thoroughly and without much hope. He turned his horse. He did not say another word. He turned, and Rance Cutler and the 3 hands turned with him, and they rode back the way they had come, and the dust rose and fell, and the afternoon was quiet. Sarah discovered that she was gripping the porch railing hard enough to leave a mark on her palm. She released it. Owen said nothing for a long moment. Then, without prelude or ceremony, he reached over and covered her hand with his, where it rested on the railing, and he left it there. She did not move her hand. The days that followed were, in the plainest sense, the strangest of Sarah Hayes's life. She could not go back to her father's house, and she had nowhere else to go, so she stayed at the Bishop Ranch in the housekeeper's room and helped with what she could help with, which turned out to be considerable. She knew cattle operations from the inside because she had grown up watching her father run one, and she could read ledgers and spot discrepancies and organize the paper side of a ranch with the precision of someone who had done it for years without acknowledgement. Owen's ranch hands, who had regarded her on the first morning with the cautious skepticism due the daughter of their employer's enemy, had by the third day begun to address her by her first name, which was the closest thing to acceptance that range hands typically expressed verbally. Owen watched all of this with a quiet attention that she noticed and did not comment on. They had arrived at a state of living in close proximity that was complicated by everything they had not said but that felt, despite its complications, more honest than anything Sarah had experienced in years. They ate breakfast and dinner together most days, and they talked, really talked, in the way they had been talking for 3 months in town, but with the added depth that came from not having to manufacture occasions to be in the same place. She learned things about him in those first weeks that she had not known. She learned that he had grown up poor in a small Tennessee Valley town, and that his father had died when he was 16, and that he had spent 6 years working other men's land before he had saved enough to come west and try his own. She learned that he had loved a woman in Memphis when he was 20 who had married a more established man, and that he had understood her reasons and harbored no bitterness about it, which she thought was either very mature or indicated that the feeling had not been what he had believed it was. She learned that he had a younger brother in Nashville who he wrote letters to twice a year, and that the letters were always slightly awkward because they were very different men. She learned that he was a better cook than he claimed and a worse sleeper than he pretended, and that he read, which she had not expected, real books and not just farm manuals. He learned things about her too. He learned about her mother, who had been a quiet woman from Georgia who had planted roses in the front of the Hayes house and died of a fever one summer when Sarah was 11, and who had been the only person in Sarah's life who had consistently told her that she was smart and that being smart mattered. He learned about the years after her mother's death when Sarah had essentially managed the household as a child because her father was not a man who concerned himself with domestic logistics. He learned that she had wanted to study in Austin or San Antonio, that she had asked twice and been refused twice, and that she had eventually stopped asking and started finding ways to educate herself inside the limitations she had been given. "You should have been allowed to go," Owen said one evening when she told him about the refused applications. "Probably," she said. "I am not sure what I would have become, though." "Someone who had more choices," he said, and his voice carried something in it that was not quite anger but was in the same neighborhood, directed at her father on her behalf. She found, to her surprise, that she could look at that and not feel defensive about it. She had stopped defending her father around the same time she had crossed his property line to warn the man her father was trying to destroy. The legal situation with the water rights took 3 weeks to resolve properly, but resolve it did. The sworn statement Sarah had made complicated Fletcher's filing enough that it triggered a formal inquiry, and when the inquiry went forward, 2 other ranchers who had been on the wrong side of Fletcher's legal creativity in the past came forward with their own accounts. Fletcher's documents were found to be fraudulent, his filing was voided, and the water rights remained firmly with the Bishop Ranch. Caldwell Fletcher left Cobb County shortly after, which was probably wise from his perspective and unambiguously positive from everyone else's. Hector Hayes made no formal move against either of them during those weeks. He was not the kind of man who accepted defeat, but he was also shrewd enough to understand when a campaign was over. He had lost the legal gambit, the fire attempt had failed, and his own daughter's testimony had sealed both failures in public record. He retreated into a furious silence that was at least preferable to active aggression. Sarah heard from one of the town women that he was telling people she had been taken in by Bishop and was not in her right mind. She heard this and felt nothing very strong about it, which told her something about how far she had traveled from the life she had been living 3 months ago. Owen heard it too. He mentioned it to her one evening after supper, not with anger but with a careful, measured consideration, the way he measured things that he was about to address directly. "He is putting a story out there," Owen said, "about you, about your state of mind. I know. People in town are going to repeat it. I know that too. It affects your reputation, your options." She looked at him across the kitchen table where they had taken to spending their evenings because it was the warmest room and the light was good. "Yes," she said, "it does." He was quiet for a moment, and she had learned by then that his quiet was not absence of thought but the opposite. She waited. "Sarah," he said, "I want to be honest with you about something, and I want you to hear it as it is meant. I am listening. Over the past months, and especially these last weeks, I have come to regard you in a way that I did not expect, and that I did not invite, and that I find myself entirely unwilling to regret. And I want you to know that what I am about to say is not motivated by the situation you are in or any sense of obligation or rescue, because I do not think you need rescuing and I have never believed you did. I want to say it because it is true and because I think you deserve to hear it said plainly." She held very still. "I love you," Owen said. "I have been moving toward that fact since the first Tuesday in town, and I have been sitting with it for long enough that I am confident it is not going to change. I am not asking you anything tonight. I just wanted you to know it because you have been honest with me about everything else and it felt wrong to keep this back." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from the window. Outside, somewhere in the dark pasture, one of the horses moved. Sarah took a breath. She thought about the distance between what you feel and what you allow yourself to name. She thought about the particular courage required to put a true thing into words when you have spent years in an environment where truth was a liability. "I love you too," she said. "I have been less honest with myself about it than you have, but I think it has been true for most of the 3 months, and I am quite confident it is going to be difficult to do anything about the fact." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, or perhaps had seen in small pieces over the weeks, and was only now seeing assembled into its complete form. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had just been told he could set it down. "Will you marry me?" he said. She had not expected him to get there that quickly, and the quickness of it, the complete lack of elaborate preamble, was so exactly like him that she found herself laughing before she found herself answering. She pressed her hand over her mouth to contain it because it was not mockery, it was simply the release of something that had been coiled tightly for a very long time. "Yes," she said, when she could speak. "I will." They were married in the last week of May 1882, in Mesquite Crossing, in the small clapboard church on the eastern edge of town, by a minister named Reverend Greer who had a long beard and an enormous sense of the appropriate gravity of the occasion. It was a small ceremony. Clara Brentwood was there, who had become something real in the category of friendship over the past weeks. Several of Owen's hands attended, standing in the back in their best shirts with their hats in their hands. Thomas Aldrich, the county clerk, came, which was a gesture Sarah understood was his way of expressing support for the statement she had made in his office. Hector Hayes was not there. She had thought she would feel something sharper about that absence. She had thought it would cut in a particular way. It did hurt, in the complicated way that things hurt when you have been expecting them long enough that the hurt is not surprise but is still hurt. But she stood at the front of that small church in a blue dress she had made herself from fabric Clara had helped her find, and she looked at Owen Bishop standing beside her with the particular quality of steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about him, and she discovered that the hurt existed alongside something considerably larger. Reverend Greer pronounced them husband and wife in the warm May morning, and Owen turned to her with his eyes very direct and warm, and he kissed her with the same quality of honest attention he brought to everything, and Sarah felt the coordinates of her life shift around a new point. They rode home to the Bishop Ranch together, and the road was long and golden in the afternoon light, and she rode beside him with no distance between them and the whole of the Cobb County range spreading out in every direction. And it was the first time in her adult life that the word home pointed somewhere she wanted to go. The ranch house was, in the weeks after the wedding, a place of significant transition. Sarah brought her energy and her organizational mind to it in ways that Owen had made clear from the beginning he was not only comfortable with but actively welcomed, which was itself a thing she had to adjust to. She had grown up in a house where her management of things was accepted because it was convenient but never quite acknowledged, never quite hers. Owen simply said, when they discussed how to arrange the house, "You know how these things work better than I do. Tell me what you need and I will make it happen." And then he did exactly that, without qualification or revision or the gradual erosion of what had been agreed. She reorganized the account ledgers and found 3 places where costs could be reduced without affecting output. She hired a cook, a woman from town named Mrs. Rosehills, who was a remarkable presence in a kitchen, and who regarded Sarah with the warm pragmatism of someone who has seen enough of the world to appreciate a woman who knows what she is doing. She planted a kitchen garden in the south-facing patch behind the house, partially because the ranch needed fresh vegetables, and partially because her mother had kept a garden, and she had missed the practice of growing things. Owen watched her make the ranch into a home and did not get in her way, which she was learning was one of the primary expressions of his love. He was not a demonstrative man in the broad theatrical sense. He did not make speeches or bring elaborate gifts or arrive at breakfast with elaborate declarations. He showed up, consistently and reliably, in every way that mattered. He noticed things. He remembered what she had said 2 weeks ago and asked about it today. He saved the best of the morning light for whatever she was reading. He left his warmth in whatever room he had just vacated. He was also, she discovered in those first months, a man of considerable depth behind the steady exterior. There were evenings when whatever burden he carried from the day, the decisions and the physical labor and the management of people and land, weighed in a visible way that he would not have named as difficulty. She learned to notice it, and she learned that the most effective thing she could do was not to question it directly, which he would have deflected, but simply to be present and talk about something else, something ordinary and real, and let him find his way back to himself. He seemed to understand that she knew what she was doing, and he let himself be known in that way without making a performance of the vulnerability, which she thought was its own kind of courage. Hector Hayes came to them in June. He appeared at the gate on a Wednesday morning with no hands behind him and his hat in his hand, which was not a posture she had seen him in before. Owen was out in the north pasture. Sarah saw her father from the kitchen window and went outside to meet him at the gate because she was not going to make him stand there and she was not going to bring him inside without Owen's knowledge, and the gate was the appropriate middle ground. He looked older than he had looked in April, or perhaps he had always looked this way and she had been too close to notice. "Sarah," he said, "Father, I heard you married him." "Yes, I did." He looked at the house behind her, at the kitchen garden she was establishing, at the general fact of the Bishop Ranch as a place where his daughter now lived. She watched him process it. "I was wrong about the fire," he said finally. "And the other business. I am not saying it because he is there to hear it or because there are consequences. I am saying it to you. What I was planning to do was wrong." She had not expected that. She had expected continued silence or continued anger or some form of pressure she had not yet anticipated. She had not expected this. "I know you know that it was wrong," she said carefully. "What I do not know is why you were going to do it anyway." He was quiet for a long moment. "I have been angry at that man for 10 years, he said. "I built this resentment into something so large that I could not see past it anymore. And you got caught in the middle. And that is something I have to live with." She thought about her mother, who had been a gentle woman trying to be diplomatic inside a marriage to a man who was constitutionally opposed to diplomacy. She thought about the roses in the front of the Hayes house that had been her mother's project and had been left to grow wild after she died because her father could not manage the care of them. She thought about 24 years of trying to love a complicated man and finding it insufficient. "Come to dinner on Sunday," she said. "Just you. Come and have dinner with Owen and me, and we will start from there." It was not forgiveness exactly. It was an offer of possibility, which was different and more honest, and her father seemed to understand that distinction because he nodded once, in the quiet way of a man who is accepting what he has been given without asking for more than he deserves. He came to Sunday dinner, and Owen received him with the precise degree of courtesy that the occasion required, which was civil and direct, and without false warmth. They talked about cattle prices and the dry summer and the condition of the roads between Mesquite Crossing and the county seat, and nobody said anything that was not true, and it was not comfortable exactly, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Sarah had come to believe, were worth more than people generally gave them credit for. Her father came to dinner twice more that summer, and each time the conversation became slightly less careful and slightly more real. And by August, he was talking to Owen about the water management issues both properties shared from the same creek system. And Owen was listening with genuine interest because it was useful information, and because Owen was constitutionally capable of setting a grudge aside when a practical thing needed to be addressed. It was not reconciliation in any dramatic sense. It was two men who had been enemies deciding, incrementally and without ceremony, that the enmity was not the most productive arrangement available. Sarah watched it happen and felt something in her ease that she had not known was tense. The autumn of 1882 arrived in Cobb County with the particular quality of West Texas autumns, warm days that still held the memory of summer and nights that dropped to something that made blankets necessary and mornings that smelled of dry grass and cooling earth. Sarah had lived through 24 of these autumns, and this one was different from all of them in every way that counted. She was, by October, quite certain that she was expecting their first child. She told Owen on a Saturday morning when he came in from the early chores and found her sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she had not drunk from, looking at nothing in particular. He sat down across from her and looked at her face with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered. "Tell me what you are thinking about," he said. "I am thinking," she said, "that we are going to need the extra room before spring." He absorbed this for about 3 seconds. Then a smile moved across his face that was nothing like his usual expression, something wider and softer and younger than she typically saw, and he reached across the table and took her hand. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "Are you well?" "I am very well, a little tired in the mornings. Mrs. Rosales has started leaving plain crackers by the coffee because she figured it out before I told her." He laughed, which was a sound she loved precisely because he did not produce it without genuine cause. "Mrs. Rosales would," he said. They sat in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the ranch coming alive around them outside, horses moving, the distant sound of the hands starting the day's work. And Owen held her hand and looked at her with an expression that made her feel, in the plainest and most uncomplicated way she had ever felt anything, entirely loved. The extra room was converted by December. Owen did the carpentry work himself on the evenings and weekend mornings he could spare, and she watched him sand and fit and measure with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything. And she sat in the doorway of the room with her knitting, and talked to him while he worked and thought that whatever she had imagined happiness might feel like when she was younger and living inside her father's house, it had not looked like this. It had not been this ordinary and this full simultaneously. Their son was born on a night in late February 1883, when a cold front was moving through, and the wind was doing things to the ranch house eaves that made the whole structure sound like it was breathing. The midwife from town, a woman named Mrs. Ellsworth, who had the calm, practical air of someone who had done this enough times to have located the fear and removed it, arrived in good time, and handled everything with efficient authority. Owen was in the house the entire time, which was not the convention, but he was not a man who was going to be told to wait on a porch for something this significant. He stayed out of the way and did everything Mrs. Ellsworth required of him and held Sarah's hand for the part where she needed a hand, and when the baby arrived, squalling and red-faced and thoroughly present, Owen Bishop, who had faced down drifters in the dark and confronted his oldest enemy at his own gate and built a life out of dry land and stubbornness, was visibly undone in a way that Sarah would remember for the rest of her days. "A boy," Mrs. Ellsworth announced, with the routine satisfaction of professional competence. Owen looked at his son and looked at Sarah and looked back at his son, and the expression on his face was not something she had words for. She filed it in the category of things that were too large and too real to require description. They named him James, for Owen's father who had died when Owen was 16 and who deserved to be remembered in something living. James Bishop came into the world on that February night and immediately began reorganizing everything around him, which Owen said with a wry affection was clearly a Hayes family trait, and Sarah said that she chose to take it as a compliment, and they argued about it pleasantly at breakfast, while James demonstrated his complete disregard for their ability to sleep more than 3 hours consecutively. Hector Hayes came to see his grandson in March, hat in hand again, and stood over the cradle in the extra room that Owen had converted and looked at the small person sleeping in it with an expression that was the most unguarded thing Sarah had seen on her father's face since her mother was alive. "He looks like you," her father said to her. "He looks like Owen," she said, "around the eyes." "Both, maybe," her father said, which was as generous a thing as he had said about Owen Bishop in the decade she could clearly remember. He held James carefully, in the slightly stiff way of a man who has not held an infant recently but remembers the principle of the thing, and James regarded him with the comprehensive suspicion of new persons that characterized his waking hours, and Hector Hayes said softly, to no one in particular, "I could have cost him this." And Sarah understood that he was not talking about the baby but about her, and about Owen, and about the whole arrangement of things that had resulted in this room and this morning. "You did not, though," she said. "We got here anyway." He handed James back to her and cleared his throat. "I think I could use some of that coffee Mrs. Rosales makes," he said, which was her father's way of changing a subject that had gone as deep as he could manage. And she led him back to the kitchen and poured him a cup, and Owen was there and they all sat down together. And it was not a perfect thing, but it was real, which she had decided was more valuable. The spring of 1883 brought rain, which was not something Cobb County could take for granted, and the Bishop Ranch's south pasture came up green, and the cattle thrived, and the water in the creek ran well above the low-season levels. Owen expanded the north herd by 30 head, and Sarah's kitchen garden became something more ambitious that started supplying produce to Clara Brentwood's household, and eventually to 2 or 3 other families in town on an informal trading basis. They rode into Mesquite Crossing on a bright April Saturday, 1 year almost exactly from the spring that had changed everything, with James in a carrier basket secured between them and the ranger, and the mare walking companionably side by side on the main road. The town looked the same as it always had, which was itself a statement about the way the world outside you can remain continuous while everything inside you has been remade. Sarah had been in this town on a Tuesday morning a year ago, loading grain into a supply wagon, and had looked up to find Owen Bishop watching her from 3 feet away, and had thought with considerable accuracy that she was in significant trouble. She had been correct. The trouble was significant. It had cost her security and home and the particular comfort of not having chosen anything. It had cost her the protection of living inside complicity, which turns out to be protection of a kind, since it removes the requirement of courage. It had cost her the version of herself that was not quite awake yet, which she had thought was a small self but had turned out to take up considerable space. It had given her back everything in different form: home as something she had helped build, safety as something she had helped choose, love as something arrived at through honesty rather than inherited along with everything else. As they rode down Main Street, Thomas Aldrich, the county clerk, looked up from his office window and lifted a hand in greeting. Clara Brentwood came out of the dry goods store and asked to hold James, who permitted this with the condescending tolerance of an 8-week-old who is uncertain of strangers but too young to adequately resist them. Owen stood beside Sarah on the boardwalk and watched James be admired by Clara, and his hand found hers at his side in the natural, unthinking way of a man who has stopped treating the gesture as significant because it is now simply true. "You know what day this is?" she asked him. "Saturday," he said. "It is also 1 year, almost exactly, since the Tuesday I met you in front of Delbert Sproat's warehouse." He considered this with the gravity it deserved. "A year and a half," he said. "You could argue that we have managed considerable ground in 12 months. I would argue that," she said. He looked at her with those steady eyes that she had catalogued and memorized and was still discovering new dimensions of. "Are you glad?" he asked. She thought about what to say to that. She thought about the night ride across the dark range, the hoofbeats on dry earth, the fire in the south pasture that did not happen, the courthouse on a morning that smelled of cedar and old paper, her father at the gate with his hat in his hand. She thought about James Bishop asleep in Clara's arms with his small, certain fists. She thought about evenings in the kitchen and the sound of carpentry in the spare room, and the way a man looked when he was building something for someone he loved. "Yes," she said, profoundly. He lifted her hand briefly to his lips, which was not something he did often enough for her to have stopped feeling it as a specific thing, and then Clara was handing James back because he had decided he was done with the arrangement, and the Saturday was moving around them with its ordinary Saturday energy, and there was nothing left to fear in Cobb County. Their daughter arrived in the autumn of 1884, on an October evening when the light through the bedroom window was the specific amber of late afternoon in West Texas, and the whole ranch smelled of harvest and cooling earth. Owen was present for this one too, as he had been the first time, and he held his daughter within minutes of her arriving in the world, and looked at her with exactly the same expression he had worn when he looked at James, which Sarah noted with the private satisfaction of a woman who has discovered that a man's capacity for this particular feeling does not diminish with repetition. They named her Margaret, for Sarah's mother, and Margaret Bishop turned out to be an extremely determined person from an extremely early age, which Owen said was both of them at once, and Sarah said that was probably the most honest assessment possible, and they both looked at their daughter in the lamplight and were helpless against how much they loved her. Hector Hayes, when he met his granddaughter, called her Maggie immediately and without consulting anyone, and Maggie tolerated this in the way she tolerated most things, which was to say with the comprehensive authority of someone who intends to be the most interesting presence in any room she enters. It was her grandfather's favorite quality, which surprised everyone including Sarah. She watched her father hold her daughter and thought that sometimes people revised themselves in the company of the people who came after them, and that this was one of the more generous things about time. James, at 2 years old, was deeply ambivalent about Maggie's arrival and deeply interested in everything else on the ranch, most specifically the horses, which was predictable given his parentage. Owen began bringing him to the stable in the mornings, at an age that most people would have considered premature, and Sarah watched her son among the horses and recognized something in the way he moved and paid attention that she recognized from his father, which was both proud and slightly overwhelming to observe. By the spring of 1885, the Bishop Ranch was the most productive operation in Cobb County, which her father had once considered an insult, and now mentioned at dinner, with the careful neutral pride of a man who has done enough recalibration to find new angles from which old things look different. He had pulled back from the more aggressive elements of his business dealings in the years since his campaign against Owen had collapsed, partly because the legal exposure had made certain approaches inadvisable, and partly because something in his confrontation with Sarah that April afternoon had stayed with him in a way that had not entirely resolved, but had not been discarded either. He was a better man than he had been, not a transformed man, not a saint, but measurably improved, and Sarah decided that this was what was available and that it was enough to work with. Owen took on a partnership with a neighboring rancher named Cal Morrison in the spring of 1885, an arrangement for shared cattle drives to the railhead at Abilene that reduced costs significantly for both operations. The first drive went well. The second went better. By the third drive in 1886, they had brought 3 other small ranchers into the arrangement, and the economics of the whole thing had become something that made a real difference to several families in the county. Sarah, who had reorganized the Bishop Ranch ledgers in her first weeks and had never really stopped being the person who understood the numbers better than anyone, found herself managing the accounting for the partnership as well, and then, gradually, being consulted by Cal Morrison's wife on the management of their ranch's books, and then by one of the other families on some contract questions, and discovering that she had built something that she could only describe as a practice, and that the practice was real and valuable and entirely hers in a way that no one could adjust or revise. Owen was not surprised by this development. He had, he told her one evening, been watching it come for 2 years. She had known it was coming too, in the quiet way you know things you have not yet admitted to yourself. James started school in Mesquite Crossing in the autumn of 1887, riding in with his father on Mondays and Thursdays when Owen went to town, and returning on the days in between with the family of a neighboring homesteader whose children attended the same school. Clara Brentwood was his teacher, which made Sarah feel a specific kind of rightness about the arrangement, and James Bishop turned out to be the kind of student who paid deep attention and asked inconvenient questions, which Clara reported with the satisfied air of a teacher who prefers inconvenient questions to no questions. Maggie was 4 years old and was, as she had always been, the most opinionated person on the Bishop Ranch. She had clear views about which horse was best, which of Mrs. Rosel's dishes she preferred, what the weather was going to do, and whether her brother was managing his chores correctly. Her brother bore her authority with the long-suffering patience of a child who has decided that resistance takes more energy than it returns. Owen handled her with a combination of firm affection and genuine respect that Sarah found extraordinarily moving to observe, because it was the parenting her father had not quite managed, and she had spent 24 years wanting without naming. The ranch house had been expanded by then, a second wing built by Owen and Cal Morrison and 2 other men over a summer and fall, and it was a real house now with a parlor and a proper dining room and a porch that caught the afternoon shade, and where Sarah increasingly spent the hour before supper with whatever book she was reading, which had become an established and protected part of her day. On an evening in late 1888, Owen came out to the porch and sat in the chair beside her, which was his chair in the way that things become belonging without ceremony, and she set down her book, and they watched the light going off the range in the particular way it went in those last minutes of a clear day, gold to rose to the beginning of dark. "I want to show you something," he said, and he held out a document she recognized as a deed. She took it and read it, and it took her a moment to understand what she was reading, because she had not expected it. It was a deed of transfer for a parcel of land adjacent to the Bishop North boundary, a piece that had been in dispute for several years on technical grounds and that had recently been resolved in their favor. "This adds 400 acres to the North Range," Owen said. "Good grazing land. The creek branch runs through the east side." "I know," she said. "I helped calculate the water yield for the application." "I know you did." He looked at her sideways. I want to register it in both our names." She looked at the deed again. In 1888 in West Texas, a woman's property ownership was not the assumed arrangement it would become in later decades. A man putting his wife's name on a property deed was a choice, a deliberate and specific one. "Owen," she said, "everything we have built here you built with me," he said. "Not for me, not beside me in a decorative capacity, with me. This ranch exists in the form it exists because of both of us, and I want that to be legible in the record. I want it to be real in the way that paper makes things real in this particular world." She held the deed carefully. Outside, somewhere in the north pasture, one of the horses was moving in the early dark. "Yes," she said. It was becoming her characteristic answer to him, and they both noticed it simultaneously. And the noticing became a smile that moved between them in the way that private things move between people who have become fluent in each other. He reached over and tucked her hair behind her ear, a gesture that was nothing and everything, and she leaned slightly into his hand. And the Cobb County range spread out before them in the last of the day's light, and was entirely, uncomplicatedly theirs. The summer of 1889 brought another child, their third, a boy they named Henry, who arrived in July on a hot, still night and announced himself with a vigor that woke the other children and impressed Mrs. Ellsworth considerably. Henry turned out to be the most peaceful of their children in his daily disposition, and the loudest in his opinions when he chose to share them, which Owen said was advanced strategic thinking, and Sarah said was simply the result of having two older siblings who had already claimed the available approaches. Hector Hayes held Henry on the day he came to meet him and was, by this point, sufficiently practiced at grandfatherhood to do it without the earlier stiffness. He was 67 years old and had scaled back the Hayes Ranch operation substantially, and the man he had been at 60, the man who had sent drifters to burn a neighbor's south pasture in the dark, was present only as a kind of historical reference point. Sarah could see him when she looked at her father and chose to, but she did not choose to often, because it was not useful. She had made a practice of choosing what was useful, which was itself something she had learned from Owen, who was constitutionally oriented toward what could be done rather than what could not. James was 9 years old and could handle a horse as well as most of the ranch hands, a fact that Owen managed with a combination of visible pride and careful safety consciousness that Sarah found charming. Maggie was 6 and was already Clara Brentwood's most challenging student, which Clara reported with an expression of resigned affection. Henry was the baby and was treated as such by all parties, including the ranch dog, a large and dignified animal named Copper, who had taken it upon himself to be located wherever Henry was at all times. In the evenings, the Bishop Ranch house held all of this. The sounds of it, children and conversation, and the creak of the house settling in the cooler night air, and Mrs. Rosel's moving efficiently in the kitchen, and Owen's voice, steady and familiar, talking to James about something to do with the North herd, or to Maggie about something she had observed with complete authority at school that day, or to Henry about nothing in particular, because Henry was 1 year old and did not yet require the conversation to be organized. Sarah sat in the parlor on the evenings she was not on the porch and listened to the sound of her life and felt the weight of it, the good, warm weight of a thing that has been built with intention and inhabits you entirely. She thought sometimes, not with pain but with a kind of clear retrospective attention, about the woman she had been at 24. The woman who had loaded grain into a supply wagon and looked up to find a man watching her, and who had thought she was in significant trouble and had been right, but had not yet understood that the trouble was the door and not the obstacle. She had ridden across a dark range with a warning that could have gotten her nothing except her father's anger and the loss of everything familiar. She had done it because it was right, because she was not her father's silence, because Owen Bishop deserved to be alive and in possession of what he had built. She had done it not knowing that he would ask her to ride home with him, not knowing that home was something they would make together from the materials of those initial honest conversations, and one April night, and a courthouse in the morning, and a long season of figuring out how to be the people they actually were instead of the people their circumstances had been pressing them toward. Owen appeared in the parlor doorway, James trailing behind him, both of them slightly dusty in the way of people who have been in conversation about something involving the physical world. "James wants to know if he can ride out with the hands tomorrow morning," Owen said. "The South herd rotation." Sarah looked at her son, who was 9 years old and had his father's eyes and her determination, and was looking at her with the composed patience of a child who has learned that his mother's assessment process is worth waiting for. "Will he stay within the perimeter?" she said. "I will," James said, "and he will not attempt to prove anything to anyone by doing something inadvisable." "I will not," James said, with a slight but honest resignation that indicated this specific instruction had personal relevance. "Then yes," Sarah said, "he can go." James Bishop managed a dignified exit from the parlor before the full extent of his satisfaction became visible, which was a degree of self-possession that Owen caught Sarah's eye about over the top of their son's retreating head. She stood up and went to where Owen was standing in the doorway and looked up at him, because even after 7 years she still had to look up slightly, and he was looking at her with the same direct attention he always gave her, and there was gray beginning at his temples now that she thought made him look more like himself rather than less. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "7 years ago," she said. "I was thinking about the night I rode over here." "That was a very long ride," he said. "It was," she agreed, although the return journey was considerably more interesting. He had asked her to ride home with him, she thought. He had asked her in those words after she had delivered the warning that changed everything. He had asked her to stay, and she had stayed, and the staying had become this house and this evening and these children and this life, and she was glad to the marrow of her for every mile of that first dark ride. Owen put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her into him in the easy, natural way of a man who has been doing this long enough that the gesture is not a performance but simply a posture, the way people arrange themselves when they are home. "It turned out well," he said, which was both the most understated and the most accurate thing he had said in recent memory. "Yes," said Sarah Hayes Bishop from the doorway of her home, with her children somewhere behind her and her husband's arm around her, and the Cobb County range going dark and familiar and safe in the Texas night. "It turned out very well indeed." And outside, the horses in the south pasture moved in the dark, and the creek ran where it had always run, and the stars came out over West Texas with the casual abundance they always offered to anyone willing to look up and take them in, and the Bishop Ranch held its lights against the night, steady and warm and entirely, finally, completely home.